The unprecedented heavy rain and major flooding that hit southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales in February 2022 hit Noosa first. And this is Noosa's story.
I remember talking to the Bureau of Meteorology and they're saying, well, it could go two ways. This thing could go offshore or it could hit us. We're not sure. We think it'd probably go offshore. It didn't. It just hung. It just came back and hit us hard.
The water continues to rise. There have been more than 6,000 calls for help and tens of thousands of homes are expected to go under across the east coast this morning.
My memory of the floods in February 2022 are still very, very front of mind. We're a small council and our teams were out doing everything they could.
Where I live, we had 1.3 metres of rain. That's a lot of water.
They're calling it a rain bomb.
The rain came 2 to 3 days earlier than expected. This was a Tuesday, it rained. It was supposed to be on Friday.
Then the landslips started to come and the damage, we started to understand what the damage was. You know, there's houses going underwater, there's people having to go to evacuation centres. There's a whole range of things that we're all dealing with, trying to make sure everybody's safe.
And your boots are wet from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. Your boots are all day. So you're walking around, you're wet. Socks, shoes, undies right through.
Of course, out on the river, we just see a continued stream of debris, whether it be boats, jet skis, logs, garbage, you name it, we've seen it.
On the Saturday morning, we said, okay, let's go and see how the river looks. We come down and our boat was nearly sinking. And I look up and I saw our friend's boat here. They had 4 anchors out on the way down the river. This river was doing at least 8 knots at this point, so it's moving fast. People with waterfront properties have a pontoon there on 2 poles and it should be anchored with chains. Water got so high so the pontoon lifted off the top of the piles and hitting and taking other debris with them.
You saw on TV the amount of rubbish that was flowing out of Brisbane River. All our currents run north towards the east coast, so we were getting a large percentage of pontoons.
Local resident Sharon Kerrigan walks the beach every morning, taking photographs of the pristine coastline. But the weather was so wild, she couldn't walk on the beach that morning.
I actually drove to coffee first thing in the morning and then went down onto the beach in front of the surf club. And there was this concrete stage. I had no idea it was made of polystyrene. And it was like, where did it come from? Someone said, it's come from Brisbane. I was like, how could it come from Brisbane? That's, it's 2 hours away. It was, unprecedented that pontoons would come up from Brisbane and land on our eastern beaches and then disintegrate into that polystyrene. You would never have thought of that in a million years, but it was our community who alerted us to it.
And then one day later, when the tide has pushed the pontoon up higher on the beach, the skirt on the pontoon scraped off immediately and there was exposed white polystyrene and thousands of polystyrene beads were just spilling out all over our beach.
It hit me like a freight train, seeing pontoons washing up and down a beach of chunks of polystyrene breaking off the pontoon and effectively just splintering into smaller fractions all up and down the beach.
These enormous, behemoth, wrangled concrete, steel frame, polystyrene bombs that were sitting in the crash line at Peregian Beach and Sunshine Beach and just going, oh, God, what are we going to do? Who can we call?
This is what we're dealing with. These giant flat pallets of styrofoam are literally sitting in the crash line of our beautiful coast and we need an emergency council response to remove this debris. This is literally everywhere. This is an emergency.
I remember getting calls from community members about the number of polystyrene pontoons that had washed up along the beaches of Noosa and how bad the environmental disaster was.
In the fires, the fire brigade came and in one night they did an exceptional job. We see a fire as a disaster. But in this case, this environmental disaster, it was a coastal catastrophe. We had no emergency services that could assist us with what was happening to our beaches. So it was up to us, volunteers, people on the beach.
So when we realised the extent of the polystyrene, we were getting phone calls from everywhere, people telling us what was happening. So we called our volunteers and we realised that there's environmental groups everywhere. We all started talking, we all collaborated, and we all needed to get on the beaches to clean it up.
I remember calling Larry, saying, Larry, I'm hearing reports about this debris, this polystyrene that's coming up on the eastern beaches. This is what's happening. What are we going to do about it? While everything else is also going on that the council staff are having to deal with. Noosa Council at this stage, and all the councils were dealing with a flood situation, a flood disaster.
I got a phone call to say that there's one being washed up in front of Sunshine Beach and it's dangerous. Can you go and have a look at it?
We didn't know how many were out there at the time.
No one realised how big and how physically dangerous they were to go anywhere near.
We don't want people to be harmed in the process of trying to clean up an environmental harm. We're not just talking about small blocks of polystyrene, we're talking about structures that were the size of buses.
Heavy seas at the time, there was high tides, there was no beach essentially, and these things are washing up and washing back, and they were massive. So then it's like, well, how do we deal with this?
It's not something that could be easily, picked up. I think most people think polystyrene is very light. The ADF, the Australian Defence Force, were looking at to see whether they could deploy helicopters to try and retrieve them, and they were too heavy for them to actually undertake lifts.
Yes, we are standing on one of the pontoons. The polystyrene is heartbreaking. The whole riverbank is literally spotted with polystyrene pieces. So that's going to be there for generations and generations. We went out and cleaned the same stretch of rubbish every day. And when you get there through the third time and you're like, I cleaned this yesterday and it's back again. You think that you're all alone in this. We literally, mentally, couldn't handle it. It was just so devastating.
And there was just polystyrene snow all over the beach.
That's the most saddening element of polystyrene. When it gets into nature and at that fraction size, it's very difficult to deal with.
What is the modus operandi for picking up tiny polystyrene and major pontoon, big pieces of debris on the eastern beaches? There's no playbook for it. We hadn't done it before.
So every bit of earth-moving equipment or every bit of useful plant to actually remove things like that was actually taken and actually dealing with much more higher priority human safety issues across the region. Council engineers and also Maritime Safety Queensland had to beg, borrow and steal every source they could to try and find equipment to actually remove the pontoons. They were also too heavy for normal earth-moving equipment to move, so they had to be broken up.
They all just stepped up and there's no backward step, no questioning it, just got to get out there and we've got to make it good as best we can for the community.
18 large pontoons arrived across the 40 kilometres of Noosa's east coast beaches.
It's just very difficult to get large machinery on a beach, machinery that's not specified and fit for purpose for that type of use.
So because we're dealing with quite remote stretches of beaches that are not easily accessible by conventional roads. There's the same sort of lovely little narrow walkways that we enjoy walking down to the beach are actually really, really problematic to take big trucks down. So we've got an ongoing issue if we have this disaster happen in the future about having good beach access to allow large vehicles to actually go onto the beach.
We manage nearly 80 to 90,000 tonnes of waste annually across our shire. So I knew exactly what polystyrene was because we don't like it in a landfill.
Polystyrene is one of the most widely used kinds of plastic. It's oil-based and commercially manufactured from petroleum. The tiny beads are moulded into shapes or blocks and often used in packaging, infrastructure and building, and to float things like surfboards and pontoons. Polystyrene is recyclable when taken to specialised drop-off locations like this.
The pontoons having cubics and cubics of meters of polystyrene in them. As soon as they hit something and split open, it goes like a cloud. It just goes everywhere.
This material doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't break down, it just gets smaller. So for each of those 14 by 4 metre pontoons with 39 cubic metres of polystyrene, and we had 18 of them here, we're going to see this stuff for a long time.
None of these agencies has any information available about how to clean up polystyrene debris across open beaches.
So each landfill has different cells which are built a bit like a tank. So they're lined at the base and they're stopping leachate from penetrating into groundwater. While you're filling that cell, you obviously have an open face, and that open face, when it rains, will generate a content called leachate. The main effect on leachate is rain. So the more rain we have, the more leachate we generate. We had a lot of storms and heavy rainfall prior to that event. Having a rainfall event like that really puts a lot of strain on a landfill. Probably a year and a half ago, we took a decision through council to build a new cell at the cost of $9 million. We have to do that to maintain our services within the community. So we have to build a cell. That's a normal procedure of landfills. Ideally, we want to limit the material going into the cells, and the more we can recycle and reuse, the better and the more length of time our cell will last. The space is a premium, so the volume of waste was going up, our space was reduced, and then we had the pontoons thrown in on top, which is another 18 pontoons. We had staff issues. We're trying to manage collecting waste, dealing with our flood-affected victims. Having pontoons delivered on trucks was pretty stressful. You're talking probably near 30 cubic metres per unit, 600 cubic metres.
600 cubic metres?
Yeah, of space that we've basically diverted away from public use when it was really necessary and really a huge requirement from the community for their flood-affected houses.
The costs of this environmental disaster went far and wide.
So when you have what would be a standard council year and budget, and that you're delivering service to the community, all of that is somewhat put on hold while you're dealing with the event, post-event, and then working into longer-term recovery.
We have, I think, 28 landslips. We still have one major landslip in Black Mountain, 30 million worth of damage and reconstruction costs, the largest ever on the Sunshine Coast. We still have some people who aren't back in their homes.
Ultimately, a $25, $30 million repair bill that, if that was council, we couldn't afford to do that in the short term. So we need the state and federal governments to support all that, and that means the whole of Australia supports all of that in terms of their rates and their taxes. But we're the ones on the face of it, doing what we can.
Deloitte Economics calculated the costs of this climate disaster at $7.7 billion to Queensland. The greatest cost is on people at $4.4 billion. The environmental costs are immeasurable.
Our community, who really came into action in those early stages and who were so instrumental in helping to clean up the debris. You know, the photos of people out there early mornings. So it was just incredible to see, again, that community spirit.
It was very clear that the more people we had with buckets and spades and sieves and brooms and handheld vacuum cleaners down there, the better chance that we would have to capture and to mitigate the dispersal.
The wind blowing them was a challenge, and you'd be down there for a couple of hours. We'd have a small amount in your bag to take back, because you'd get it to a point where you'd be clustering it and away it would go again. And with every wave came in more or took out more to come back again at another point.
It's the scary pollution that we just can't pick it up.
We did numerous trials where we trialled industrial-style vacuum cleaners with a lot of manpower to see if we could clean up the polystyrene on an industrial scale. That proved to be not so effective. We trialled several different variations of that, and none really were ideal.
We've been using tractors and beach grooming tractors to pick up the large chunks. We've trialed vacuums at various scales, but unfortunately the only method that is working to date for the smaller bits is actually people and community action, picking it up by hand.
We have picked up over 219 tons this year, a ute of rubbish every day. And the most of that is polystyrene from the pontoons. For the first 4 months, I think, we did 2 loads a day. And we were cleaning 5 days a week.
The most effective way that we found to get rid of any of those tiny bits of polystyrene was using handheld vacuums.
Straight after the flood event, of course, polystyrene is everywhere. When we say everywhere, it's in the ocean, on the beach, it's up in the dunes, and unfortunately it will be in our wildlife.
So as you can see, Alison's trying to pull chunks of it out. It's literally just beneath the sand. So it's all been kind of covered. Apparently the pontoon was removed a couple of weeks ago, but 5% of it still remains. And we are spending our time digging up the last 5%.
The sensitive beach environments along the east coast are home to marine turtles and rare shorebirds. And March is when turtles hatch and run from their nest to the shore.
I think we had at least 3 or 4 nests actually run and have to go through that kind of pollution spill on our beaches.
The other thing to do is throw your hands in the air and walk away, but you just couldn't do that anymore.
Noosa Council initiated a polystyrene roundtable to hear the many perspectives of those involved in the environmental disaster.
So that roundtable really brought a great group of people together with a lot of really good ideas.
And we were really careful to include everyone in the conversation all the way through, because we wanted the lessons to be learned.
This is an environmental disaster. How do we then bring that in with the disaster management?
It was really frustrating at times trying to get accurate information that a lot of the environmental groups were relying on to mobilise their volunteers to be at the hotspots.
The Polystyrene Roundtable highlighted the need for improved responses to environmental disasters, better communication with community and environment groups, and better regulation and design standards for pontoons and marine infrastructure.
Having that open line of communication is really important going forward.
So coordination between the council and the community groups who are actually, as I said, living and breathing it because they're there every day. It's really important, fundamental.
Some of the recommendations were identification plates on the existing pontoons, being able to track, tag and locate, looking at the use of polystyrene in the first place, looking at the design of the pontoons.
The annoying thing from my perspective as a waste manager is we are trying to recycle material. Everything in that design on its own is recyclable. The steel is recyclable, the polystyrene is recyclable, the polyurethane is recyclable, and the concrete is recyclable. And we recycle pretty much every one of those elements on our site now. They're very difficult to break down into the individual components, and you need to do that to obviously recycle them. So it was very much of a shame to see pontoons that big all being placed into a landfill, of which there are 18. I do believe you should go back to the root source or material types that you put into a design. Yes, cars are made right now to be fully recycled. From my point of view, I would question the building blocks of pontoons around a material like polystyrene.
We're going for the cheaper option up front, but then we're paying environmentally for generations to come.
But also cleaning up our waterways.
Cleanups of environmental pollution have traditionally been a recovery event after the event had occurred. But now we know that they need to be something that happens ongoing, always at the start.
They're our most prized and protected natural assets, and we need to continue to protect them. It's so important. It's important at every level. So what can we do better to clean up our rivers, to make them resilient, for our beaches, for our coasts? We need to have a huge focus on their protection and enhancement going forward.
We could draw lines on a map and say that's this shire or that shire, that's this ocean or that ocean. The reality is there are no boundaries in nature. And so what's our problem? It's not just Noosa's, it's the Sunshine Coast, it's the east coast of Australia. It then moves out into the ocean, it becomes the world's problem. It's far bigger than Noosa, and I think that's where the levels of government need to work together.
We also know that we need to attack the problem at the source, not just cleaning up where it's already reached the environment, but tackle the problem at the source.
In 2022, the global ocean was the warmest on record, making more water and energy accessible to weather systems and the processes that generate significant storms and extreme rainfall events. This is why heavy rainfall is expected to continue to become more intense with climate change. Australia's weather systems are changing. In the coming decades, Australia will experience ongoing changes to its weather and climate. It's expected that short-duration, heavy rainfall events will increase in intensity in Australia with climate change. Climate change is predicted, but it's also unpredictable.
It's important to note that the weather wasn't just one event. It was actually a rolling series of events, and we had warnings issued for weeks after. With climate change, this issue is not going to go away. We're going to end up with more, extreme, storm events leading to situations like this.
Disaster can have many different facets that you may or may not be ready for. We certainly weren't ready for 18 or so pontoons to wash up on the beaches. I think there's a real responsibility from the suppliers and builders of these pontoons to understand the gravity of what happens in these situations, not necessarily the people who own them. So it's in our interest to remove polystyrene, and that's been our trial.
Noosa Council has created a polystyrene recycling facility at the Noosa Landfill and Resource Recovery Centre, free for community use. Noosa Council has completed a threatened fauna recovery roadmap. Sea turtles have been identified as a priority species, with a recovery action plan to be developed for the 2023 nesting season.
We've got to learn our lessons as well, because again, we've had floods before, and we've got to get better at how we manage that in terms of the destruction and the ongoing effects of that. Particularly when it's stuff that we've never experienced before, you've got to be even more patient, because we've got to learn as we go.
I regard the polystyrene disaster that occurred on our beaches to be one of the most significant environmental debacles that Noosa Shire has ever faced.
It's a catastrophe, what's happened here, and we're going to see the impacts of it for a very long time.
So 18 months later, we are still finding polystyrene absolutely everywhere. We're finding it embedded in our dunes, we're finding it in turtle nests, and we're finding it on all of our cleanups washed up along our coastline.
So what have we learned? We've learned that environmental disasters require a coordinated emergency response. The cleanups were community-led, and this has shown us we need better communication. Polystyrene is not appropriate for marine environments, and more than ever, marine infrastructure needs to be recyclable and resilient to climate impacts. We've learned that cleaning up rivers and waterways is a crucial preventative action, and there are no boundaries, requiring regional collaboration and shared responsibility. Climate change is happening with huge effects on council's capacity and staff and community wellbeing, and whilst predicted, climate change is unpredictable with unprecedented impacts.
It's not over.
It continues to be a challenging time. This day hasn't finished by a long shot.
We need the government to step in and address an issue like polystyrene and move away from it and say we can't use that anymore for the generations to come. They should inherit this world in as good, if not better, condition than we inherited it.
Again, I want to thank our community who did so much of the heavy lifting, but also our council staff. At the end of it, you go, wow, what a community. This is a community that really pulls together. That's something to be so incredibly proud of and grateful for.
We've learned that little things, whether it's a drop of rain that leads to flood, a particle of CO2 that contributes to global climate change, a tiny bead of polystyrene that becomes part of a disaster, or a hand picking it up that is a crucial part of recovery. We've learned that little things, indeed every little thing, makes a big impact.